Hello, you're watching Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. I'm Young. Now, Chinese President Xi Jinping made a closely watched Middle East trip last week, meeting with nearly 20 Arab leaders, most notably Saudi Arabia. His bilateral summits and the first ever China Gulf Cooperation Council was described as being Beijing's largest and highest level diplomatic engagement with the Arab world since the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. Now we zoom in on this trip and what it means in the context of Beijing's rivalry with Washington. For this, we connect with Xi Zhenyan, Associate Professor at Sichuan University, and Yang-gyu, Principal Researcher of the East Asia Institute. Very warm welcome to you both, and thank you so much for joining us today. My first question goes to you, Professor Xi. Now, Chinese leader Xi Jinping, he headed to the Middle East last week, as we remember, and he held the first ever China Gulf Cooperation Council, or GCC, meeting at the King Abdulaziz International Conference Center in Riyadh. Now, what purpose did this council meeting really serve both sides?
Yes, I think for this summit meeting, from China's side, definitely due to the bad or the poor relationship now between China and the US, I think China is trying to look for more new ways to open the world new relationship with other countries, especially now for the Middle East. And I think China tries to also, especially to make some deals like politically and economically, so that due to the decoupling of China and the US, China may find different ways to improve its economy and improve its influence in the world, or from the region or from the international parts of the world, so that in the future it may break through the deter of the United States.
I see. And well, what would your views be on this, Dr. Kim?
Well, it's always not easy to read the minds of people, and understanding, states' purpose is also difficult. So let me answer this question by briefly going over this joint statement of the Riyadh summit between GCC and PRC on December 9th. And let me focus on two areas. One, the two things they emphasize and two things they're missing. One of the issues they emphasize is they are willing to deepen cooperation between the two sides in the areas of energy, trade, investment, finance, industry, and advanced technology. And although they talk also about the security issues like terrorism and non-proliferation, main topics on the table was economy and technology, and energy, of course. And two, they make it a core principle to respect for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-interference in their internal affairs. And this sounds pretty familiar, as all these principles have been heavily emphasized by Beijing so far. Then what is missing in the statement? One, although President Xi Jinping emphasized in his speech during the meeting that China wants to trade oil and gas with their currency, RMB, but this is not included in the statement. Two, except for briefly mentioning that two sides want to complete the free trade negotiations between them as soon as possible, not much was included in the statement regarding the trade. Therefore, I think the main purpose of the meeting was twofold. First, they want to increase cooperation on the economic front, and oil is a spine of their relationship, of course. And Saudi Arabia is the number one oil supplier to China, and Beijing gets 1/5 of its oil from Riyadh. And Saudi Arabia, China is #1 trade partner, and China was the biggest beneficiary of China's Belt and Road Initiative. So it is pretty obvious and natural to predict that the two sides want to increase their economic cooperations and oil, energy cooperation especially. But however, second thing is that this does not mean that GCC is pivoting to China away from the United States. I think they will continue to use dollars for their energy trade, and GCC are still hesitant to talk much about trade issues. So I do not believe that Saudi Arabia and other GCC countries seek to replace the United States with China.
Right, there was certainly a lot of attention on that, whether the GCC would be joining China in the move against de-dollarization, for instance, and that's why there was so much attention on, especially on Saudi Arabia and Professor Xi. Now, Xi Jinping and the Saudi Arabian Crown Prince, they agreed to strengthen their trade and political ties, focusing very much on mutual cooperation. The two leaders agreed to meet every 2 years as well. So we're seeing that they're very keen to really strengthen their ties there. And well, what does all of this really mean for the United States?
All right. With the strengthening relationship between China and the Middle East, so politically, we say the U.S. is trying to to make China be lonely in the world stage, and it has many different kinds of alliances across the whole world. So, but China is trying to strengthen the relationship with the Middle East, and in the meantime, I think it wants to gain more support on the world stage. And economically, we know that U.S. wants to slow down the development of China, and since it always regards China as a threat, so China, I think, tries to build more economic and trade relations with the Middle East. So in the future, so with the deterioration of the China-U.S. relations, China can still keep a certain pace in the development of its economy. So I think this means a lot to China, and of course, for the U.S. side, it may find it's not that easy to slow down the development of China's economy.
Right, so we're seeing, well, America moving towards decoupling and China obviously reaching out to other nations. And well, Dr. Kim, how does President Xi Jinping's then outreach to the Middle East really affect the US-China rivalry?
Well, as Professor Xi already mentioned, let me just briefly talk more about the Washington's position on this. I think this will definitely make Washington unhappy as Saudi Arabia decrease rather than increase oil production after President Biden's July visit to Riyadh, despite Biden's explicit requests. So it will show another case of decreasing influence of Washington over the Middle East region. And on November 14th, during the G20 Bali summit, President Biden met President Xi Jinping in person. Biden explained that the United States will continue to compete vigorously with the PRC, including by investing in sources of strength at home and aligning efforts with allies and partners around the world. So applying the basic IR theory here, it looks like a classic example of internal and external balancing measures against Beijing, as Professor Xi also mentioned. And also regarding Xi's visit to Saudi Arabia, Washington said during the press briefing that the U.S. is not telling countries around the world to choose between the United States and the PRC, but what it seeks is to give countries around the world options, the most attractive option available, and emphasize the U.S. competitive advantage is in its ability to build coalitions, partnership, and ability to integrate defensive structures. All this seemed pretty clear to me that U.S. will continue to compete with China and ask U.S. allies in the region to join its effort to make the options Washington provides more attractive. I think most like-minded countries in Europe and Indo-Pacific, like Korea, Japan, and Australia, will support the U.S., of course, but the challenge will come from other regions, like Middle East, as demonstrated this time.
Certainly, there is a clear contrast, as you mentioned, between President Biden's trip to Saudi Arabia. I mean, for President Xi Jinping, they rolled out the purple carpet and they made all of these very forward-looking promises. But, well, in terms of other countries, though, U.S. allies, Dr. Kim, how do you see Xi Jinping's outreach to the Middle East from a Korean perspective?
So the question will be, is China has enough capability to defend itself from this pressure coming from Washington? I think this is going to be the critical area. And actually, China has been doing so, responding to the U.S. threat of decoupling since the Trump era, when the former President Trump attacked the company Huawei. And Biden's administration basically continues similar attempts by creating Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, or Fab 4, more well known in Korea as a Chip 4. And I think Washington still has the dominance in the core technology areas, and especially the semiconductor is the key weaknesses of Beijing. But China is also catching up in 5G and AI sectors, which makes it become increasingly complicated to predict the future. And the war in Ukraine and the subsequent international community sanction against Russia actually showcased how U.S. could potentially attack China economically. And this is why Xi Jinping emphasized quality growth and self-reliance in the 20th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party. And China has been focusing on measures to defend itself from U.S. pressure. One of the main areas it has been focusing on is building an RMB-based global commodities trading system. And major Chinese oil suppliers like Russia, Angola, Venezuela, Iran already accept RMB in their oil trade. And I think Beijing wanted to expand this system to Middle East. If it is succeeded, and if it succeeds in the future, I think China will have a strong shield that can protect Beijing in resisting U.S. attempt to exclude China in the global supply chain. But China also has offensive tools as well, and namely its dominance in the rare earth materials production. These materials are key materials for producing IT commodities like smartphones, computer hard drives, flat screens, and China will continue to enjoy about 80% share of their producing rare earth materials globally. And China also extending investment to global ports and having greater control over global shipping flows via port acquisition. This will impose serious challenge to South Korea. Both Washington and Beijing have numerous tools to pressure Seoul. So as long as the competition is intensifying, Seoul's strategically will be reduced and will be imposed by both sides. So for the next 4 to 5 years, I think it's going to be a very challenging time for South Korean diplomacy.
Right, and certainly China is very capable in 5G and AI, as you mentioned, and it's looking to, companies like Huawei are looking to Middle Eastern markets, it seems, to expand their telecommunications technology there. And well, Professor Xi, my next question to you then will be about China's technological capacity. Of course, that there is this Made in China 2025 goal, and beyond that, China was very much hoping to achieve its goal of self-sufficiency in producing leading semiconductors and emerging technologies. And well, how is it faring on that front amid this global sort of movement towards decoupling? That's to you, Professor Xi.
Yes, the Belt and Road policy has expanded China's international influence, and China's internationalization of the renminbi has threatened the hegemony of the US dollar. Moreover, China has good relations with Russia, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. In the eyes of the United States, China's actions are not only seeking development but challenging its status as a world hegemon. Moreover, China has continued to expand and attract foreign investment in recent years. In the first half of 2022, China absorbed the foreign investment of 723 billion yuan, a year-on-year increase of 17.4%. In order to contain China, the United States created an Asian-Pacific economic framework. So what does China need to do? That is to expand the economic and trade ties between China and the rest of the world in an all-round way so that the rest of the world is unwilling to sever ties with China. Therefore, China has implemented a domestic and international double cycle strategy, international cycle and domestic cycle. International cycle means materials, technology, and wealth can flow relatively freely between domestic and international markets so that China can continue to maintain a strong momentum of development. At the same time, carry out the domestic cycle to prepare for the rainy day so that the development of foreign countries alone cannot solve the worries of the future. Once China and the United States formally conflict, China's energy import and export will be greatly threatened. Therefore, it is a must to take advantage of China's population and large market advantages to develop a domestic cycle of economy. China has recently re-emerged as a power in the Middle East, and China has gained a number of advantages there with few regional entanglements and a stated desire to remain apolitical in the region. through its Belt and Road Initiative. It has increased levels of economic engagement in the Middle East. Its more neutral political stance may have appeared refreshing to many ordinary citizens across the region. With the exception of Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinian territories, every Middle Eastern country, including the other 7 surveyed by Arab Barometer, has signed onto the BRI. China has recently signed a significant liquefied natural gas supply deal with Qatar, which shows the decoupling between China and the US has no negative effect on China's outreach to the Middle East. From the point of the high technology development, China, I think, still has some difficulties to fully be sufficient with its own needs. And I think it still needs some time.
I see. Well, it looks like the power rivalry between the 2 biggest superpowers is not just contained here in the Indo-Pacific. It seems it's towards the Middle East as well. And well, we'll have to continue to see how those relations develop. But this is where we end the interview today. That was Xi Zhenyan, Associate Professor at Sichuan University, and Yang-gyu, Principal Researcher of the East Asia Institute based in Seoul. Thank you both so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Also, thank you very much to our viewers for tuning in. Global Insight will be back on Thursday, South Korea time. Do tune in then. Have a great day. Bye.